In the summer of 1781, Lord Cornwallis was hunting a ghost in the American South. Instead, he walked into the greatest tactical trap in military history. This trap didn't just capture 9,000 of Britain's best soldiers, it was built by a secret weapon nobody saw coming, a weapon that destroyed the entire British Empire's ambition in America. Forget the musket. This is the story of the impossible machine that won the Revolutionary War. The air in the Carolinas and Virginia was thick, heavy, and exhausting, carrying the fine, stinging dust of relentless, fruitless pursuit. Lord Charles Cornwallis, a general of unquestioned talent and elite European training, felt a gnawing frustration that was chipping away at the foundation of his confidence. He had executed the Southern strategy, a bold, grand plan to conquer the rebellious colonies from the bottom up with fierce determination. He had won the major engagements, crushed the Continentals at Camden, and though he suffered grievously, he held the field at Guilford Courthouse. He was winning every battle, but the war was slipping through his fingers. His best troops, the elite Redcoats and their Hessian allies, were worn down, their once pristine uniforms ragged, their boots falling apart. They were exhausted, perpetually marching to the scent of a shadow, the young Marquis de Lafayette's army. This was no pitched battle army. It was a mobile, maddeningly elusive corps, led by the 24-year-old Frenchman who refused to be drawn into a decisive engagement. Lafayette was a master of delay, harassment, and evasion, keeping the main British force contained and bleeding through constant skirmishes without risking his own destruction. Cornwallis found himself trapped in a war of attrition, winning skirmishes but losing the strategic ground, miles from any secure base or fresh supply line. By mid-summer, the general's patience was utterly spent. His supplies were critically low, his men were succumbing to heat and dysentery, and he was desperate for a secure port from which to reorganize, strike a decisive blow, or, failing that, be evacuated by the dominant Royal Navy. His strategic mind sought solidity in a land of phantom armies. He surveyed the maps, looking for a secure haven on the coast of Virginia. He made the fatal decision. He chose Yorktown, Virginia. It was, on the surface, perfect. A sleepy, small tobacco port situated on the bluffs of the York River, it offered deep water access for the mighty British ships. It was defensible, surrounded by ravines and swamps, and crucially, it was exactly where he believed the overwhelming supremacy of the Royal Navy guaranteed his safety. The fleet, he reasoned, would bring reinforcements, fresh supplies, and provide the unassailable path of extraction. He believed he was stepping onto secure ground. In truth, he was walking into a self-constructed cage. This inherent reliance on British naval power, this deep-seated, fatal hubris, was the precise moment the turning point of the war solidified. He was about to learn that the sea was not a sanctuary. This reliance was not just a miscalculation, it was a deadly assumption that would be shattered by a massive French surprise coming not from land, but from a place the British thought they owned, the ocean. Hundreds of miles to the north, in the sweltering, humid camps outside New York, a decision of global magnitude was being hammered out in tense, whispered meetings. General George Washington and his French counterpart, the Comte de Rochambeau, had for months maintained the illusion of a grand, decisive attack on the massive British stronghold of New York City, held by General Sir Henry Clinton. They had built their plans, massed their forces, and executed feints, all pointing toward New York. But the French admiral, the Comte de Grasse, commanding the largest and most powerful fleet in the French West Indies, had sent a crucial message that changed everything. De Grasse was willing to commit his entire, massive fleet, nearly 30 ships of the line, to the American theater, but only for a brief, critical window of time, and only to the Chesapeake Bay. Washington, who had long desired to strike New York, was forced to confront the dazzling reality of the opportunity. The chance to trap Cornwallis with French naval superiority was a prize too great to ignore. He and Rochambeau had to make a seemingly impossible decision: abandon the meticulously planned attack on New York and secretly march their entire combined Franco-American armies, 12,000 men strong, 400 miles south into Virginia. This was the Washington Gambit, an immense risk undertaken with stunning secrecy and boldness. The logistical nightmare was staggering. An army of that size, hauling heavy siege artillery, supply wagons, forage, and thousands of horses could not simply vanish. They executed an elaborate, time-consuming feint, building new camps and ostentatiously baking huge quantities of bread in massive ovens near New York to convince General Clinton that the attack was still imminent and they were settling in for a long siege. The deception was maintained down to the level of officers writing letters hinting at the New York operation, knowing they would be intercepted. Under the deepest veil of this deception, the Allies slipped away in late August. The combined force began its grinding, secret march south. This monumental logistical achievement, coordinated by Washington and funded in part by a massive infusion of French gold, was a feat of synchronized movement that few European armies could have managed. The column stretched for miles, marching with unprecedented speed for such an enormous force. The American contingent was ragged and determined. The French contingent, in their immaculate white and blue uniforms, were a professional, well-equipped contrast. But even if they made the 400-mile march in secret, the entire plan would fail unless one single man, thousands of miles away, kept his word. Would the French admiral arrive in time? The entire success hinged on a coordinated, three-part convergence that had to be timed to the day, perhaps to the hour. First, Washington and Rochambeau's army, the Hammer, had to complete its march and arrive outside Yorktown. Second, Lafayette's small force, the Anvil, had to keep Cornwallis contained and fixed in place, preventing any easy retreat up the peninsula until the main army arrived. Finally, the crucial, final piece, the French fleet, the wall, had to control the sea lanes. If any one of these three elements failed to synchronize, the entire expedition would become a costly, humiliating disaster, and the revolution could well be lost. The Franco-American army, after weeks of relentless marching, arrived near the Chesapeake in September, exhausted but exhilarated. They had done the impossible. The massive army was in position. Cornwallis realized too late that the ghost he was chasing was no longer a shadow, but the leading edge of a gigantic continental trap, and he was squarely in its jaws. He looked to the sea, confident that his rescue was only a matter of time. He was about to learn that the trap had a hidden lock, a lock made of salt water and French cannon. For years, the American Revolution had been primarily a land war, decided by the smoke of muskets, the grit of militia, and the sheer endurance of the continental soldier. But the fate of 9,000 elite Redcoats, trapped on a sandy spit of Virginia land, would not be determined on that soil. It would be decided 40 miles out at sea, in one of the most strategically significant naval battles in history. The true strategic weapon of Yorktown was not a gun or a siege trench, but a powerful, decisive naval fleet, the 28 ships of the French Navy under the command of Admiral François-Joseph Paul, the Comte de Grasse. De Grasse was the hinge of history. His decision to commit his entire force from the West Indies to the American coast was a massive, all-or-nothing risk, a move that permanently ceded French naval dominance in the Caribbean for a chance at a single, decisive stroke in North America. It was an unprecedented gamble. By the end of August, de Grasse arrived at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. His massive ships of the line formed an impenetrable floating barrier, a complete wall against any British relief. He immediately used his deep water position to offload vital French siege artillery and 3,300 troops to reinforce the continental and French land forces, ensuring Washington had the manpower and heavy guns necessary for a formal siege. The naval wall of water was in place. A British rescue was swiftly dispatched. Admiral Sir Thomas Graves, commanding a smaller, 19-ship British fleet, had hastily sailed south from New York. Graves was confident in the long-held tradition of British naval supremacy, yet his fleet was a patchwork force, with several ships in poor condition, and his personal tactics were cautious, rigidly adherent to old rules of engagement. He arrived off the Capes on September 5th, intending to relieve Cornwallis and drive off the French. The ensuing engagement, the Battle of the Chesapeake, also known as the Battle of the Capes, was not a simple skirmish. It was the most important naval engagement of the war, a strategic masterclass by de Grasse. The French commander, despite having been caught with many of his men ashore and his line slightly disorganized, aggressively ordered his entire fleet out to sea to meet the British. successfully luring them away from the vital bay entrance. Graves, attempting to follow the strict, methodical naval fighting regulations of the time, struggled to maneuver his line of ships against the aggressive, decisive French movement. The wind favored Graves initially, but de Grasse quickly gained the tactical advantage. The two lines of massive ships of the line clashed in a thunderous, smoke-choked exchange of cannon fire. The French line was superior in numbers and, crucially, in tactics. The French did not simply target the hulls of the enemy ships as the British traditionally did. They concentrated their fire on the masts, sails, and rigging of the British vessels, crippling their mobility. This tactical difference was crucial. The detailed breakdown shows the immediate, debilitating damage caused by the French barrage. Several British ships were disabled and rendered uncontrollable, including the Terrible, which was so badly battered it later had to be deliberately scuttled. The British suffered 336 casualties, men killed or wounded to the French 210. The British confusion was compounded by Graves's poor tactical coordination with his sub-commander, Admiral Hood. After 2 hours of intense, brutal fighting, the sun set and the battle broke off. For the next several days, the two massive fleets shadowed one another, the silence of the sea punctuated by the creak of damaged timbers. But the British ships were too badly damaged to challenge the French again. Graves, realizing his fleet could not force a relief and that French reinforcements were arriving from Newport, made the devastating, fateful decision. He retreated back to New York for repairs and reinforcements, leaving Cornwallis completely and irrevocably stranded. The French victory was a strategic triumph that sealed America's fate. The French fleet now acted as the wall of water around Yorktown, completing the physical encirclement of Cornwallis's army. The sea, the very element Cornwallis had relied upon for his safety, was now his greatest threat. The land forces could now move, unhindered by fear of British naval intervention, and the long, systematic process of the siege could begin. The trap was sprung, the final lock turned. Washington surveyed the prepared British defenses. Cornwallis, an excellent defensive engineer, had established a line of redoubts and earthworks. A frontal assault against these fortifications would be suicidal, costing thousands of lives and squandering the strategic advantage the Allied forces had just won. Instead, Washington reached for a weapon centuries old, but utterly new to the Americans, the military spade. This was the Battle of the Spade, where the Franco-American allies began to methodically bury the British alive, constructing their doom one shovel full of Virginia earth at a time. The Allies were about to practice the elaborate science of siegecraft, and they had the world's best teachers. The French engineers, particularly the brilliant General Louis Lebesgue du Portail, brought a technological and intellectual superiority to the field. Their plan was not to storm the defenses, but to approach them through a series of protected, excavated paths known as parallels. The strategy was to inch forward under protection, bringing the overwhelming power of their artillery ever closer until the enemy's main position was rendered indefensible. The goal was to construct successive trenches that would bring the heavy siege artillery which de Grasse had so expertly delivered ever closer to the enemy's main lines. The engineers detailed the use of gabions, wicker baskets filled with earth used for temporary protection, and fascines, bundles of sticks used to shore up trenches and fill ditches to rapidly construct the works under fire. These tools allowed for fast, protected construction and a massive reduction in casualties. On the evening of October 6th, the Allies began the construction of the first parallel. Under the cloak of a deep, moonless darkness, the combined Franco-American digging forces, 14,000 strong, demonstrated a stunning discipline. The night was cold, the ground softened by recent rains, which allowed the massive work to proceed with speed and, most importantly, silence. The trench was to be over 2,000 yards long, stretching from the river on one side to the swampy river plain on the other, designed to completely encircle the British outer works. The psychological horror for the British must have been immense. Cornwallis's troops woke up on the morning of October 7th to find a massive, permanent line of earthworks, dug in a single, silent night, staring them down at 600 yards. The enemy had, quite literally, vanished underground, and the Redcoats now faced an entrenched foe who could only be shelled, not charged. It took only 3 days for the massive Allied guns to be hauled into position and armed in the new parallel. On the afternoon of October 9th, the artillery barrage began. The French opened fire first, followed shortly by George Washington himself, who allegedly touched off the first American cannon. The fire was deafening, overwhelming, and continuous. The sheer volume and size of the Franco-American guns, 24-pounders, 18-pounders, and heavy mortars were unlike anything the British had faced in the war. Many were heavy French siege pieces designed to shatter stone fortifications and level defenses. The Allied forces deliberately maintained the unrelenting pace, firing day and night to prevent the British from making any repairs. French hot shot cannonballs heated to a glowing red set the British frigate HMS Caron and 2 transports ablaze, burning them to the waterline and further emphasizing that the sea was no longer a sanctuary. Cornwallis watched as his position became rapidly untenable. With his outer works under such constant, overwhelming fire, he realized he had to withdraw his forces to an inner, more protected area. The methodical, unrelenting pressure of the digging and the fire was the silent, scientific weapon that was grinding his army to dust. Yet, even after days of this relentless fire, 2 key British strongholds still stood, mocking Washington's lines and preventing the final deadly blow. To win, they would have to break their own rules of siegecraft and risk everything on a silent, savage night assault. The Allied first parallel had done its job of inflicting damage and demoralization, but the methodical, deliberate pace of the siege demanded a swift final move. On October 11th, Washington ordered the start of the second parallel, a new trench line that would bring the Allied guns to within a mere 300 yards of the main British defences. This new, deadly noose was almost complete, but 2 forward fortifications stood in the way of its final completion along the river, redoubts 9 and 10. The capture of these 2 strongholds was mandatory. Until they were silenced and integrated into the Allied lines, they prevented the final, point-blank batteries from being built and maintained a dangerous flank fire on the digging parties. The fate of the entire siege, and therefore the war, came down to a single, savage, bayonet-only night assault planned for October 14th. Washington had 2 targets, and he entrusted them to 2 young, ambitious commanders, 1 American, 1 French, creating a friendly competition between the Allies. The dual commanders represented the spirit of the alliance at its fiercest. For Redoubt 10, the smaller but closer position, Washington chose Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton, leading 400 American light infantry and sappers. Hamilton, who had spent the last several months chafing at the logistical work, thirsted for glory and a chance to prove himself in command. For Redoubt 9, the more heavily defended position, the task fell to the French Royal Deux Ponts Regiment, led by the Baron de Viomenil. The French, professional soldiers famed for their disciplined shock tactics, were given the larger, more difficult target. The rule of battle was strict. The assault was to be carried out only with bayonets. There was to be no loading of muskets. This order was given to ensure absolute silence until the moment of contact, to prevent accidental friendly fire in the pitch darkness, and to make the rush terrifyingly chaotic and swift. The assault would rely entirely on cold steel and brute surprise. The order was simple, but terrifying. The charge would rely only on cold steel and a screaming rush, a terrifying display of brutality intended to shatter the enemy's nerve. It was a cinematic climax. At 8 o'clock that evening, a brilliant, deafening French artillery barrage on the redoubts signaled the attack, a thunderous noise meant to cover the sound of the approaching infantry. Under cover of this noise and the thick darkness, the 2 columns rushed forward simultaneously. The Americans, led by Hamilton, approached Redoubt 10. Sappers, armed with axes, charged ahead of the infantry to hack through the abatis, a thick outer barrier of sharpened, felled trees. The British inside fired wildly, alerted by the noise of axes, but the Americans, driven by Hamilton's desperate energy and the adrenaline of the charge, rushed the works. They did not pause for ladders. They simply climbed over the high earthworks, scrambling up the soft dirt of the parapet and leaping down into the central fighting space. Within 10 minutes, The redoubt was overwhelmed in a chaotic, close-quarters brutality that left the British and Hessian defenders stunned and quickly captured. At the exact same moment, the French charged Redoubt 9. Their advance was more methodical, a testament to their famed discipline. They successfully used scaling ladders to mount the walls, swarming the position with disciplined efficiency. Though the fighting was savage and bloody, some French troops even mistakenly bayoneted their own German allies of the Royal Deux Ponts Regiment. In the darkness and confusion, they completed their task with incredible speed. The victories were secured within 30 minutes. Both redoubts, the final barrier to the British inner defense, were in Allied hands. The engineers immediately swarmed the captured ground, racing against time to incorporate the positions into the second parallel. By the following morning, the new batteries were built, armed, and ready to open fire at point-blank range on Cornwallis's main works. The breaking point had been reached, and the noose was complete. After 19 days of methodical terror, a relentless scientific grind of siegecraft and overwhelming fire, the siege was over. The combined Franco-American forces had proven that the mighty British Army, long thought to be invincible, could be trapped, cornered, and utterly destroyed. Lord Cornwallis, humiliated and broken, spent the night of October 16th preparing his final desperate gambit. It was the last desperate act. Cornwallis attempted a midnight evacuation, ferrying his able-bodied troops across the York River to Gloucester Point, hoping to cut his way north to New York. The first boats made it across, but then, a sudden, violent storm, a tempest of furious wind and rain rose up, scattering the remaining fleet and making the river crossing impossible. This was the final, devastating stroke of misfortune that sealed his fate. The following morning, with his ammunition dwindling and his position completely untenable under the point-blank barrage of the newly built batteries, Cornwallis made the emotional decision. At 10 o'clock on the morning of October 17th, a single drummer boy beating a parley and an officer waving a clean white flag appeared on the British parapet. 2 days later, the surrender documents were finalized and signed, officially ending the siege. The surrender ceremony on the afternoon of October 19th, 1781, was a poignant and profoundly political moment that signaled the birth of a nation. The Allied armies stood in two long, immaculate lines, the Americans in their tattered but proud continental uniforms on one side, the French in their immaculate white and blue regalia on the other, stretching for over a mile. The total number of prisoners being surrendered exceeded 7,000, a devastating loss. Cornwallis, utterly broken by the shame of capitulation, refused to attend the ceremony, feigning illness. He instead sent his second-in-command, General Charles O'Hara, as his proxy to perform the humiliating act. O'Hara attempted to surrender his sword to the highest-ranking officer, the French commander, Comte de Rochambeau. Rochambeau, recognizing the immense political significance of the moment, politely declined the honor and directed O'Hara to Washington. Washington, equally incensed by Cornwallis's petulance and refusal to face the consequences of his defeat, declined to receive the surrender personally as well, directing O'Hara to the American second-in-command, General Benjamin Lincoln. Lincoln, who had himself been forced to surrender to the British at Charleston, accepted the sword. This final sequence of actions was a profound statement of global political recognition. Britain was not surrendering to a French proxy. It was surrendering, through a carefully orchestrated chain of command that affirmed American sovereignty, to the new United States. The moment the sword passed to Lincoln, the American Revolution gained its validation on the world stage. As the British and German troops marched between the silent, victorious lines to lay down their arms, a total of 7,247 soldiers, the atmosphere was thick with significance. It is a persistent legend that the British band played the tune "The World Turned Upside Down." While historians have debated the veracity of this story, the emotional weight of the alleged music is undeniable. Regardless of the exact song, witnesses recorded the tune played was slow, melancholy, and careless, an appropriate soundtrack for the profound defeat of the mighty empire. The surrender at Yorktown did not immediately end the war, but it broke the political and financial will of the British Parliament. The news caused Prime Minister Lord North to cry, "Oh God, it is all over." The victory proved, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the American Revolution was not a doomed rebellion, but a viable, sovereign entity capable of winning on the global stage. So, what was the true secret weapon that destroyed the British Redcoats? It was not the musket, the bayonet, or even the devastating siege cannon. It was the cohesion and discipline of the Franco-American alliance. It was the logistical masterpiece executed across 400 miles. It was the naval superiority of de Grasse's fleet. It was the intellectual genius of Duportail's siege engineers. It was the willingness of two nations, one fledgling, one established, to execute a perfect, coordinated military, naval, and logistical strategy. Yorktown was the proof that the combined might of freedom's allies was an unconquerable weapon, forever turning the world upside down. We hope you enjoyed this look at one of the most brilliant strategic achievements in military history. What other forgotten moments of the revolution should we cover? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with a friend who loves history. Thank you for watching. Be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of history, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next chapter.